So I'm wondering if you've ever had a similar experience. Have you been in a conversation with someone, and in that conversation they make a statement or ask a question, and they don't think much of it in the moment, but for some reason it strikes a chord, or it strikes a nerve. And the conversation moves on, but the question for you still remains. And it's one of those questions or comments or statements that stays with you. It won't leave you alone no matter how hard you try to forget it. Have you ever had one of those? When that experience happens, I try to stop and pay attention, especially if I don't want to answer the question. It's usually telling me something. And so I had one of those experiences a few weeks ago. I was in a conversation with Jim Ramsey, our director of music and arts, and I can't even tell you what the full conversation was about. We were talking about worship at St. Luke's, and in the midst of the conversation, he asked me, I think what he thought was a question that may or may not have had much meaning. He asked what inspired my preaching. And then the conversation moved on, and I really didn't have much chance to answer it in the moment, and it has stuck with me in these last couple weeks. And so I started reflecting on the question, and that question actually morphed into a whole different question, maybe not whole different, but it morphed into what inspires your life. And that reminded me of a question that clergy are asked throughout our ministry, but especially during our ordination process, that process to become a clergy person. And it's a question about our call. We are asked, more times than I can tell you, to share a call story. Almost every clergy person has this call story. And it's a story about our journey into ministry. It isn't so much about the particulars of our education or our process or our denominational requirements. It's a story about why we decided to become a minister. A story about hearing the call from God. So it's a call story, that call from God. And at every stage along our process to become clergy, with each new set of interviews and each new set of groups of people we talk to, we are invited to tell that call story almost ad nauseum. It's the story of why we're going to do what we're going to do. And the neat thing actually about these call stories, I serve on the board of ordained ministry for our conference, which is the group that decides who becomes clergy. And so I hear these call stories all year long. And these stories are as unique and different as the person telling it. Some stories speak of years of trying to avoid God, running away from God, running away from the church, running away from the sense of being called into ministry. Some speak of how they tried to ignore the call until almost it slapped them in the face. And some stories talk of instantaneous moments, almost like a lightning bolt, when a call became clear. Some people start seminary in the process not really sure what's going on, what their call is, and they hope that it will become clear along the way. I don't know about Ryan and Sally, but I think things became less clear when I started seminary. I think that's part of the process. So after 3 years in seminary and 3 more years in the ordination process, I could recall my call story so well that it almost became rote. I almost didn't have to think about it. I could just tell you this story. And I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing. I kind of got sick of telling the story. And then Jim asked me, what inspires your preaching? And it led me down this path, and it took me back to that question of call. So I know you haven't asked me, but Jim did, so I'm going to tell you my call story. So as many of you know, I grew up in the United Methodist Church. My mom was, and still is, a Sunday school teacher, a liturgist, which means she helps lead worship, read scripture, write prayers. She's chaired, I think, almost every team or committee that a church has except trustees. I'm not sure why she never worked with trustees. I myself was president of my confirmation class and a number of years president of the youth group, which we had then. I preached on youth Sundays beginning in junior high. I think I attended every conference youth event that was offered. I even started tithing to the church when I got my first job at age 16. And my sister asked me why. And I didn't know how to answer it because I didn't know there was any other way to be. I remember in high school, one of the missionaries that our church sponsored came to visit, and she met with the youth on a Sunday night at our youth group, and I sat mesmerized as she talked. I listened to her story, and something connected, something stirred, something sparked, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. I knew I didn't want to be a missionary, but there was something about her story that resonated. But I didn't know what to do with it, so I kind of let it go for a few years. And then I went off to college, Western State in Gunnison, Colorado. And for the first time in my life, I did not have a United Methodist community. There wasn't a Methodist church. There still isn't a Methodist church in Gunnison. So I joined friends when they went to church. I attended Catholic Mass. I tried out some non-denominational churches. I think I maybe had a Lutheran or Presbyterian church service in there. I even joined the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And if you know me, you know I'm not an athlete. But all my friends were volleyball players, so they kind of let me sneak in. But nothing felt right. Something was missing. I knew enough to know that, but I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And then in my second year of college, I was home for winter break, and I was in a conversation with my mom. And when I'd come home from college, or my sister would come home from college, we'd end up in those conversations till 2 or 3 in the morning, just kind of talking about everything. So it was one of those conversations up until 2, and I was struggling. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was an econ major. I have my bachelor's in economics, and I love economics, but I couldn't see myself as an economist for the rest of my life, and I didn't know why. I just knew that it didn't feel right. So we were talking, and we were talking, and we were talking, and finally my mom just stopped, and I can still remember this moment clear as day. She stopped and gave me this look that I don't think I'd seen that look in her before. This kind of, I can't even tell. She just stopped and looked, got really quiet, and said, "Are you telling me you want to be a minister?" And I couldn't even answer her. I just started crying. My family and friends who know me best know that me crying is not a big deal. I'm the person that cries with every emotion. If I'm mad, if I'm frustrated, if I'm sad, if I'm happy, I cry. A good Hallmark commercial and I bawl. My girls love to laugh at me for that. I'll be honest, we went and saw Mamma Mia, my mom and my 2 daughters and myself saw Mamma Mia too, and I was crying through the whole thing. I cry. But it was one of those moments, have you ever just had a release of emotion that you didn't even know was there? I just cried in that moment. In that moment, I discovered something. I released something. I hadn't even realized before that moment that I even thought about ministry. And yet in that moment, it was as clear as anything has been clear in my life. I felt called into ministry. And in that moment, every plan I had changed. So that's the short version of my call story. It can be longer. And I've come to discover that I think it's a shame that question of call, at least culturally, is reserved for clergy. You don't have that conversation in many other professions. Tell me about your call. It seems to be acceptable in the church, but if you ask someone else about their call, which I have done over the years, I kind of usually get this off-putting look of, I don't know what you're talking about, or I'm not sure I want to tell you. Why is it that clergy seem to be the ones who can talk about their call? Because I know that clergy aren't the only ones who are called into their vocation. I think any vocation can be a call. And I know that sometimes our call isn't necessarily related to our jobs. I learned that watching my parents. My mom is a massage therapist, has been for 40 years. Through much of her career, she partnered with therapists working with sexual abuse survivors. She's helped in the healing process by offering massage, offering healthy and therapeutic touch while individuals work with their counselors, focusing on the healing of the whole person. She's worked with survivors of plane crashes and car crashes. She's worked with infants, newborns, within hours. She's worked on colicky babies, which can help prevent or get rid of colic. She's partnered with chiropractors and acupuncturists. I think she has a call into her vocation. I think it's clear, and she has lived that out. And I think my dad had a call too, although he wouldn't ever use that language. He's the guy who never went to church and still doesn't, and so he humors me sometimes with church language, but it is outside his comfort zone. So I talk about his call, but it had nothing to do with his job. My dad's call was all about his family. He chose his job not because the work itself brought him joy, but because the work allowed him to put his family first, to support his family in the way he wanted to. It allowed him flexibility. I think he attended all of our sporting events, our extracurricular events, anything that we asked him to be at, he was there. He started working in a warehouse at a small family-owned business in Denver when he was, I think, 18, 19, 20, and he retired as the general manager. He was successful because he found a job that allowed him to live out his call, not only with his family, but in creating a sense of family in his workplace. Family was his call. And so I watched my parents each live out their sense of call in very different ways. And so I go back to that question, what inspires your life? What is your call? And is your faith connected to your answer? I'll be honest with you. The Gospel of John is not my favorite gospel. Matthew is my favorite. I can't necessarily tell you why. If I open the Gospels, I usually go to Matthew first and John last. I'm very aware of my bias. I work really hard not to only preach from Matthew. So I figured it was time to go to John. But it was actually really easy because John has some of my favorite scriptures. The Gospel of John was written at the end of the first century, somewhere around 90 to 100 CE. And we know that Jesus died around 33 CE. So the Gospel of John was written some 60 to 70 years after Jesus' death. Odds are the author of John's Gospel was not a direct disciple of Jesus, but rather a disciple of a disciple, perhaps of a disciple. And the accounts in John would have been handed down from generation to generation in that community through oral tradition for years before it was ever written. And I love oral tradition, but I think we have to be realistic about it. We all know those fish stories that people love to tell. The fish that was really only about 6 inches long, but within 10 years, man, it was a 3-footer. We know how oral tradition goes. Stories change based on who's telling the story or who's hearing the story. Stories change based on what's needed in the moment and in that community. It isn't a deceptive thing. It's a natural process of storytelling over the generations. And the Gospel of John is very different from Matthew and Mark and Luke. In John, Jesus doesn't speak in parables like he does in the others. Instead, he uses long, complex discourses that are almost easy to get lost in. In John, Jesus spent most of his time in Judea and Jerusalem rather than Galilee, as in the other 3 Gospels. And in John's Gospel, Jesus' divine identity and status was part of the teachings from the very beginning. In Mark and Matthew and Luke, Jesus refrained from claiming that he was God. Instead, he referred to himself, or the writers refer to him as the Son of God or the Son of Man. How Jesus speaks of himself is different in John than in the other 3. John's gospel is different. Many describe it as a more spiritual gospel, a gospel focused less on the historical accounts, trying to get at who the person of Jesus was and is. And what I do find fascinating about John's gospel is we learn what Jesus had become for that particular community at the end of the first century. Almost 70 years after Jesus' death, this is who he had become for that community, why they followed him. And I think that speaks to many people still today for the same reason, who Jesus has become to us and why we follow him. And John's community followed Jesus because through Jesus they experienced God. Through Jesus, they found their calling to faith, their inspiration to life, their motivation, and their grounding. And we see this in chapter 14 of John's Gospel. I'm going to read from a different version than you probably know. It's called the Inclusive Bible Translation. And John says this: "Rabbi," Philip said, "show us Abba God, and that will be enough for us." Jesus replied, "Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and still you don't know me? Whoever has seen me has seen Abba God. How can you say, 'Show us your God'? Don't you believe that I am in God and God is in me? The words I speak are not spoken of myself. It is Abba God living in me who is accomplishing the works of God. Believe me that I am in God and God is in me, or else believe because of the works I do. The truth of the matter is, anyone who has faith in me will do the works I do, and greater works besides. Why? Because I go to Abba God, and whatever you ask in my name I will do, so that God may be glorified in me. Anything you ask in my name I will do. If you love me and obey the command I give you, I will ask the one who sent me to give you another helper, who will be with you always, the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot accept, since the world neither sees her nor recognizes her. But you can recognize the Spirit, because she remains with you and will be with you. I won't leave you orphaned. I will come back to you. A little while now, and the world will see me no more, but you'll see me, because I live, and you will live as well. On that day you'll know that I am in God, and you are in me, and I am in you. Those who obey the commandments are the ones who love me, and those who love me will be loved by Abba God. I too will love them and will reveal myself to them." The imagery this scripture creates is one of my favorite, one of my grounding scriptures. Jesus speaks of being in God and God in him, of God living in him, being revealed in his works. And then he says the same is true for us. He said, "The truth of the matter is, anyone who has faith in me will do the works I do, and greater works besides." Why? Because God is in us, and we are in God. Most of the clergy I know can boil down their ministry into one purpose statement or one elevator speech or one 140-character tweet. We've been trained to do it. And it's an important question, I think, for all of us. Can we answer that why? What inspires us? What grounds us? What motivates our life? And I realized at some point along the journey that my answer, my why, my inspiration comes from the scripture. I think we are all on a journey to connect with the God in us and to connect with the God in each other. Yet communally, culturally, we're very far away from doing this well. I think it's evident in the divisiveness of our world, our country, even our denomination. We've lost connection with the divine that is part of us and part of each other and part of every person, whether we know them or not. The divine is what connects us. And when we lose that connection, it makes it easy to label people as others or less than or different, or judge their lives as wrong and ours as right, or separate people under the guise of following law. To This loss of connection actually makes it easy to establish laws that benefit the few at the expense of the many, because we've lost connection. And then I turn to Scripture, and I'm reminded that Jesus shows us another way to be. He's our reminder and our example of what that other way looks like when we live grounded in God, knowing we are in God and God is in us. It's what inspires my call, what inspires my life. We're about to watch a video of Bon Jovi's song, It's My Life. And the video, you might find an interesting one, wonder the connection, but when I watched this video, it struck me. It centers around one young man on a mission. He wants to get to the place he's trying to get. And it is so clear, his mission is so focused that no matter what obstacle is in front of him, whatever happens, he pushes through to reach his goal. He knows so clearly what grounds him that nothing will stop him. Finding our inspiration doesn't have to mean a life-altering change or even a vocational change. It might not mean that big of a change at all, but it could lead us to a new way of living in our everyday life, a new way of being. What inspires you, and are you living into it?